Her heart stopped. Page 1 to 12. A forged signature. Alderman Hayes's name, glaringly false. Our beloved Mayor Thorne was stealing thousands meant for Bridgeport streets. The beautification project? A cruel betrayal. Darling, this one page would shatter his perfect world. Before I continue, drop a comment telling me where you're listening to this from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You won't want to miss the ending. Eleanor's fingers, slender and precise, traced the column of figures in the thick ledger. The City Hall office hummed with the soft scratch of pens and the distant murmur of voices, a familiar symphony she'd grown to love. Every morning, she found a quiet comfort in the order of numbers, the way they told a clear, undeniable story, unlike people who were often so terribly complicated. Today, her task was the City Development Fund Ledger, a rather grand name for the book holding all the expenses for the Bridgeport beautification project. Mayor Thorne had spoken so passionately about it, about new paving stones and trees, making their town the envy of the county. She turned to the section for October, her brow gently furrowed in concentration. Her supervisor, Mr. Finch, a kind man with perpetually worried eyes, had mentioned a slight discrepancy. A feeling, really, more than a fact. "Just a quick glance, Eleanor," he'd whispered, his voice hushed as if the ledgers themselves might eavesdrop. "Mayor Thorne is very particular about this project." Eleanor, with her almost photographic memory for details, started at the beginning, cross-referencing invoices with entries. Most of it was perfectly ordinary. Receipts for saplings, labor costs for street sweepers. But then, a flicker. A small, almost imperceptible inconsistency in the sums. A slight overpayment here, a curious round number there, that didn't quite match the invoice she'd recall seeing weeks ago. Her heart gave a little flutter, a nervous bird trapped in her chest. She pushed her spectacles higher on her nose, leaning closer. And there it was. Page 112. An entry for granite paving stones, North Main Street, dated October 14, 1903, for a staggering $7,800. Beneath it, the scrawled signature of Alderman Hayes. Eleanor knew Alderman Hayes's signature better than her own. She processed his travel vouchers monthly. This was not it. Not even close. It was clumsy, hesitant, yet trying desperately to mimic his usual confident flourish. A cold dread, a heavy sinking feeling settled in her stomach. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. This was a lie, bold and brazen, hidden in plain sight. She sat back, the leather chair creaking softly. The hum of the office suddenly sounded distant, muffled. Mayor Thorne, the charming, benevolent Mayor Thorne, had been funneling money meant for their town, for those beautiful streets and trees, right into his own pockets. The thought was so ugly, so monstrous, she almost felt faint. She looked at the forged signature again, a silent scream trapped in her throat. Later that afternoon, Eleanor approached Mr. Finch's desk, the heavy ledger clutched in her hands. "Mr. Finch," she began, her voice a whisper, I found something." She opened the book to page 112, pointing with a trembling finger. Alderman Hayes's signature. It's not right. Mr. Finch peered at it, his face paling as he recognized the implications. He looked up, his eyes wide with fear, not just for the town, but for them. "Eleanor," he breathed, "you must be mistaken. This could ruin everything." He gently closed the ledger. "Perhaps you just need a rest, dear. It's been a long week." He couldn't bring himself to look at her directly. The fear in his eyes was palpable, a chilling echo of her own. The next morning, the air in the Treasury Department felt strangely thin. Eleanor had barely settled at her desk when the door to Mayor Thorne's private office opened, and his stern-faced assistant, Mr. Davies, appeared. "Miss Vance," he announced, his voice stiff, "the mayor wishes to see you immediately." Eleanor's heart thumped, a frantic drum against her ribs. She knew. As she walked down the polished corridor, each step felt heavy, irreversible. Mayor Thorne sat behind his imposing desk, looking far less charming than usual. His eyes, usually twinkling, were cold, hard chips of ice. He didn't offer her a seat. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice surprisingly soft, almost a purr. "I understand you've been scrutinizing the City Development Fund ledger rather closely, specifically an entry from October." He paused, letting the silence stretch, thick and suffocating. "It has come to my attention that certain discrepancies have been discovered in your recent filings. A missing receipt for office supplies, an overcalculation in petty cash. Small things, perhaps, but quite serious for someone in your position of trust." His gaze hardened. "I'm afraid we can no longer have you handling the city's accounts. Your services are no longer required. Effective immediately." The words hit her like a physical blow. Dismissed, accused. Her quiet dedication twisted into something illicit. Her hands clenched. But she met his gaze, a spark of defiance now burning in her eyes. He thought he could silence her. He was gravely mistaken. The City Hall doors had closed behind Eleanor with a chilling finality. Dismissed. The word echoed in her mind, cold and sharp. Her landlady, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose kindness was as thin as her patience, gave her a week to find new lodgings, new work. It wasn't enough. Eleanor packed her few possessions, mostly books and a sensible coat, into a single worn trunk. Her small, neat room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage she was being forced from. She found herself drifting towards the older, less reputable parts of Bridgeport, where the cobblestones were cracked and the gas lamps flickered weakly. Her new room, a cramped space above a noisy tavern on Elm Street, smelled perpetually of stale ale and something indefinably damp. The window looked out onto a narrow alley, not the bustling market street she'd grown accustomed to. The rent, though shockingly low, still felt like a mountain she had to climb each week. Each morning, she'd smooth her dress, brush her hair, and venture out, a polite, "No, thank you, we're not hiring," following her from one shop to another, from one respectable office to the next. Her reputation, that cruel whisper of dismissed for discrepancies, had reached further than she'd imagined. Food became a calculation, a grim arithmetic of pennies. A stale roll, a thin broth, sometimes nothing more than water to fill the gnawing emptiness. The chill of late autumn crept into her bones, and the worn shawl she pulled tighter offered little comfort. Loneliness, a heavy shroud, settled over her. She missed the quiet camaraderie of the office, the comforting weight of a ledger in her hands. She missed Mr. Finch's timid nods. Even? Meanwhile, just a few miles away, but in a world entirely separate, the grand Thorne estate glowed with warmth and merriment. Mayor Thorne, ever the gracious host, threw a lavish autumn ball. Eleanor read about it in the newspaper, a crumpled page she'd found discarded in the street. "Mayor Thorne's generosity shines," the headline proclaimed, detailing the exquisite decorations, the imported champagne, the new gown Mrs. Thorne wore, a shimmering emerald silk, far grander than anything Eleanor had ever seen. The descriptions of the floral arrangements alone probably cost more than Eleanor would earn in a year, if she even found work. She pictured him, Mayor Thorne, charming everyone, his smile wide and practiced, his hand perhaps resting on his wife's arm. He probably felt quite pleased with himself, the darling of Bridgeport, celebrating his ill-gotten gains. The thought was a bitter taste in her mouth. She imagined the very granite paving stones that should have lined North Main Street, those $700–800, now paying for champagne and silk. He hadn't just taken money, He'd taken the dignity of their town, and now he'd taken hers. One cold afternoon, passing by the city's central square, Eleanor saw a gleaming new carriage, its horses prancing proudly, pulling none other than Mayor Thorne and his wife, Lydia. Lydia was laughing, a bright, carefree sound, her new hat adorned with an elaborate feather. Thorne caught her eye for a fleeting second, a flicker of something unreadable, before his gaze slid away, as if she were merely part of the scenery, a forgotten speck. It was a harsh reminder of how small she had become, how easily dismissed. Back in her small room, shivering under a thin blanket, Eleanor stared at the grimy ceiling. He thought he had won. He thought she was broken, silenced. But the image of page 112, the clumsy forgery, was seared into her mind. It was a truth that refused to be forgotten, a quiet fire still burning within her. She might be cold, hungry, and alone, but she wasn't defeated. Not yet. The air in Eleanor's little room above the tavern was thick with the smell of old wood and something vaguely like regret. Her stomach rumbled, a hollow, persistent ache. It had been weeks since she'd seen a proper meal, let alone a kind face. She sat on the edge of her lumpy bed, staring at the small, battered trunk that held everything she owned. Hope, once a flickering candle, felt like it was about to gut her out completely. With a sigh that felt too heavy for her slender frame, she began to rummage through the trunk, not really looking for anything in particular, just needing to do something. There were her mother's old lace doilies, a book of pressed flowers, and at the very bottom, tucked beneath a stack of old letters, a small, worn, leather-bound notebook. Her personal ledger. She used to jot down small things in it, little reminders, interesting figures, sometimes even a grocery list if her memory was feeling particularly flighty. Her fingers, still bearing the faint marks of ink from her old job, traced the familiar cover. She opened it, the pages rustling softly, like dry leaves. Most of it was mundane. Entries about her rent, the cost of a new pair of shoes last spring, the price of a loaf of bread. But then, tucked between two pages, a crumpled carbon copy of an invoice fluttered out. It was for Imported French Topiaries, Grand Park Redevelopment Project, dated 2 days before she was dismissed. The amount? A breathtaking $1,200. Eleanor stared at it, her brow furrowing. Topiaries, for the Grand Park. She remembered the project, of course, the plans for a lovely new rose garden. But $1,200 for topiaries? Even the grandest park wouldn't need such an extravagant sum for a few sculpted shrubs. Her mind, even weary, began to pick at the threads of memory. She closed her eyes, trying to pull herself back to the bustling City Hall office, to the days before everything went dark. She remembered a Tuesday morning, perhaps 6 months ago, when Mrs. Thorne herself had swept into the Treasury Department. Not for city business, no, but to pay a personal bill. Eleanor had been busy, but she'd overheard Mrs. Thorne, her voice bright and lilting, chatting with Mr. Finch about the magnificent French topiaries that had just arrived at the Thorne estate. Oh, Silas insisted. She'd laughed. For the summer garden party, you know. They cost a fortune, but they are utterly divine. A jolt went through Eleanor, sharp and sudden. The exact phrase, magnificent French topiaries. The memory was so clear, so vivid. She remembered thinking at the time that Mrs. Thorne seemed rather pleased with the extravagance. Now looking at this invoice for the Grand Park Redevelopment Project, the pieces clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. $100 or $200 for city topiaries? No. These weren't for the park. These were for the mayor's own private garden party, paid for with the city's money, disguised as a public improvement. It was a mathematical error, yes, a glaring misallocation of funds. But it was more than that. It was a direct, undeniable link between Mayor Thorne's public works and his personal luxury. He wasn't just siphoning money for vague beautification supplies from shell companies. He was buying his wife's party decorations and charging them to the honest citizens of Bridgeport. A slow, fierce heat began to spread through Eleanor's chest, chasing away the chill of the room. He hadn't just fired her. He'd tried to erase her, but he'd left a crumb, a tiny, glittering piece of evidence that she, and only she, could connect. She looked at the crumpled paper, no longer just a scrap, but a weapon. A quiet, determined fire now burned in her eyes. He thought he had silenced her. He was gravely, wonderfully mistaken. The invoice for the topiaries, that scrap of paper felt like a burning ember in Eleanor's hand. It wasn't just a number anymore. It was a story, a terrible, twisting story of betrayal. She knew, with a certainty that hummed in her veins, that the Grand Park had never received those expensive French shrubs. Mayor Thorne had simply used the city's ledger as his own personal shopping list. But knowing wasn't enough. She needed proof. Something undeniable that even Mr. Finch, bless his timid heart, couldn't ignore. The city archives. That was it. A musty, quiet place tucked away in the basement of the old municipal building, rarely visited by anyone outside of historians or very dedicated clerks looking for dusty old property deeds. It was the kind of place where truths, sometimes inconvenient ones, often lay hidden, patiently waiting to be found. Getting in, though, would be the first hurdle. She was no longer an employee, and the stern-faced guard at the main entrance knew her. She waited for 2 days, watching the entrance from a discreet distance, bundled in her thin coat, until she saw a familiar figure emerge during a lunch break. Old Mr. Henderson, the archive's lone custodian. He was a kindly man, always had a cheerful word, who probably remembered her from her days of fetching old records for Mr. Finch. "Mr. Henderson?" she called, her voice a little breathless as she approached him. He squinted, then his face softened in recognition. "Miss Vance?" "My dear, what brings you to this part of town? Haven't seen you since." He trailed off, remembering her sudden departure from City Hall. Eleanor offered a small, polite smile. "I'm researching a bit of local history, Mr. Henderson, for a personal project. The old Grand Park redevelopment plans from a few years back. I was hoping to look at the original blueprints and material lists, if you wouldn't mind. For a quiet afternoon, you know." She tried to sound nonchalant, like a lady with a leisurely interest, not a woman on the edge of ruin. Mr. Henderson, bless his sweet nature, nodded slowly. "Oh yes, the park plans. Lovely project. Come along, dear. It's a bit dusty down there, but I'm sure we can find what you need. Always happy to help someone interested in our city's past." He led her through a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors, the air growing cooler and thicker with the scent of aged paper. The archive itself was a cavernous space, rows upon rows of tall wooden shelves, groaning under the weight of countless forgotten documents. He pointed her towards a section. "I believe the Grand Park plans are over there, Miss Vance. Box 3B, if memory serves. Take your time, dear. I'll be back up in an hour or so for my tea." Eleanor's heart hammered a frantic rhythm. She moved quickly, her fingers almost dancing over the labels on the boxes until she found it. Grand Park Redevelopment Project, 1901-1903. She pulled it down, the cardboard gritty under her touch. Inside, nestled among rolled-up blueprints and architectural sketches, were thick folders labeled Procurement and Budget Allocations. She opened the Procurement folder first, her eyes scanning for anything related to plants, to landscaping. There were entries for indigenous saplings, for bags of topsoil, for benches and lampposts. She found a detailed list of ornamental plants purchased, hardy roses, sturdy hydrangeas, even some climbing ivy. But nowhere, not a single line, was there an entry for imported French topiaries. Not $1,200 worth, not $12, not even a single dollar. The budget allocations confirmed it. A small sum was set aside for general ornamental shrubs, a mere fraction of what the invoice claimed. A quiet triumph surged through her. There it was, the hard, undeniable proof. The park never received those topiaries. They had gone straight to Mayor Thorne's estate, paid for by the honest citizens of Bridgeport. The silence of the archive seemed to amplify the truth of it, a truth so stark, so utterly clear. She carefully refiled everything, placing the box back on its shelf as if she'd just been a curious historian. But in her mind, she carried a weight far heavier and far more dangerous than any dusty ledger. She had confirmed her darkest suspicion, and now a path, however perilous, lay before her. Eleanor smoothed her worn skirt, her fingers trembling slightly. The dress was her best, though it had seen better days, and she'd spent an hour trying to coax her hair into a respectable bun. The archive had given her the proof she needed about the topiaries, a clear, undeniable link. But to truly bring Mayor Thorne down, she needed to connect him directly to that forged signature on page 112 of the City Development Fund ledger, to show a pattern of deceit, not just an isolated incident. She needed to get back inside City Hall. The thought made her stomach churn, but a cold resolve settled in her heart. This wasn't about her pride anymore. It was about justice. She walked through the familiar heavy oak doors of City Hall, her head held high, though her knees felt weak. The same guard, Mr. O'Malley, nodded curtly, recognizing her, but his eyes held a hint of suspicion. She requested an audience with Mayor Thorne, her voice surprisingly steady. "I merely wish to apologize and to ask for any work, however humble," she'd told his assistant, Mr. Davies, feigning a tremor in her voice. An hour later, she was ushered into Mayor Thorne's grand office once more. He sat behind his desk, looking even more imposing than she remembered, a slight smirk playing on his lips. He gestured to the chair opposite him, a small concession that felt more like a calculated display of power. "Miss Vance," he purred, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I heard you wished to speak with me." Eleanor clasped her hands in her lap, forcing herself to look down, to project humility. "Mayor Thorne," she began, her voice soft. I've been terribly foolish. My mind was clouded by personal troubles, and I made errors in judgment. I beg your forgiveness. I am desperate for work, sir. Any work. I assure you, I have learned my lesson." She felt a pang of shame at the words, but swallowed it down. It was a performance, and she had to play her part. He leaned back, a smug expression spreading across his face. "Indeed, mistakes have consequences, Miss Vance, but perhaps there is a place for you. We often have need of extra hands for filing, for tidying up the old records. Nothing taxing, of course. No financial responsibilities." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. She was too untrustworthy for anything important. It would be temporary, of course, a trial, and under strict supervision. Eleanor looked up, her eyes wide and grateful, a tear welling up, perfectly timed. "Oh, thank you, sir, thank you. I would be most diligent, I promise." And just like that, she was back, not in the Treasury Department, no, but in the General Records Office, just 2 floors above her old department. Her task was monotonous, sorting old correspondence, meticulously relabeling dusty boxes. It was a cruel irony, handling paper that told little stories, while the biggest story remained hidden. One afternoon, Mr. Davies, Mayor Thorne's stiff assistant, bustled into her office. "Miss Vance, the mayor requires the original City Development Fund ledger for a brief moment. He's meeting with Alderman Hayes and wants to reference a specific expenditure. It's in the Treasury, of course. Would you fetch it for me? Mr. Finch is out for the afternoon." Eleanor's heart leaped. This was it. The very ledger. "Of course, Mr. Davies," she replied, her voice calm, despite the frantic drumming in her chest. She walked down the familiar corridor, her steps purposeful. The Treasury office was empty, just as Mr. Davies had said. The ledger, heavy and dark, sat on Mr. Wythe Finch's desk, exactly where she knew it would be. And since you've made it this far, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps me keep bringing stories like this. Her fingers, quick and practiced, flipped to page 112. The forged signature, so clear, so damning. She pulled a small, thin sheet of tracing paper from her pocket, something she'd prepared weeks ago, and a soft lead pencil. With a steady hand, she carefully, quickly, traced the contours of the false signature. Not a perfect copy, but enough to show the telltale wobble, the hesitation that bespoke a forgery. She could feel the precious few minutes slipping away, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. She quickly returned the tracing paper to her pocket, closed the ledger, and carried it back upstairs, her face a mask of careful neutrality. The final piece. It was hers. The grand meeting room at City Hall, usually reserved for town council debates, felt particularly hushed and formal. A long mahogany table gleamed under the chandeliers, set with crisp white linen and an array of crystal glasses, each catching the light. Eleanor had spent the morning preparing it all, polishing the silver tea service, arranging little plates of biscuits, her hands moving with a quiet efficiency that belied the frantic flutter in her chest. Mayor Thorne had called a special gathering, a very important one, Mr. Davies had stressed, for several prominent bankers and lawyers from out of town. It had something to do with securing a large loan, or perhaps a new investment for the Thorne family's vast land holdings, the whispers said. Mayor Thorne himself swept in, followed by Lydia, his elegant wife, who was chatting brightly with Alderman Hayes. Lydia, in a soft blue gown, looked perfectly at ease, completely unaware, Eleanor thought with a pang, of the rot at the heart of her husband's prosperity. Thorne's smile was wider than usual, his eyes gleaming with a practiced charm as he greeted each esteemed guest. He was performing, Eleanor realized, putting on the grand show he always did, making everyone feel important, respected. Eleanor, dressed in her plainest gray dress, hovered near the back, ostensibly to ensure teacups were filled and biscuits replenished. But her gaze was fixed, not on the pastries, but on the mayor, her ears straining to catch every word. "Gentlemen," Thorne began, his voice smooth as silk, filling the room. "Thank you for coming. As you know, Bridgeport is a town on the cusp of something truly magnificent. Our beautification project has transformed our streets, our parks are blooming, and our civic investments are yielding remarkable returns." He gestured expansively, as if the very air around them was shimmering with prosperity. "My family's estate, the very heart of Bridgeport's heritage, stands as a testament to this growth. We are merely seeking to secure further capital to expand our ventures, to bring even more prosperity to this wonderful community." He spoke of figures, of growth projections, of the untapped potential of his land, all delivered with an air of absolute certainty. The bankers nodded, seemingly impressed, occasionally scribbling notes in their small books. Alderman Hayes beamed proudly, oblivious to the fact that his own name had been crudely scrawled on a fraudulent document the mayor was still referencing. Eleanor poured tea, her hand steady, though inside a cold fury simmered. She watched Thorne's confident gestures, his unshakable facade. He spoke of new trees for the park, of beautiful paving stones, and all the while, she saw the ghost of the forged signature on page 112 and the phantom French topiaries blooming in his private garden, paid for by the very citizens he was now trying to impress with his supposed generosity. A tall, distinguished lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, cleared his throat. "Mayor Thorne, your presentation is indeed compelling. However, for a loan of this magnitude, we would, of course, require full transparency regarding all current financial obligations. both civic and personal. A detailed review of all municipal funds and private assets would be paramount. Thorne's smile didn't falter. Naturally, Mr. Caldwell. Complete transparency. We have nothing to hide. Our books are open, our records meticulously kept. We pride ourselves on our integrity in Bridgeport, both in public service and private enterprise. He glanced briefly towards Eleanor, a fleeting look that seemed to challenge her. She merely met his gaze with a blank expression, then turned to offer a fresh plate of biscuits to a banker. The meeting continued for another hour, a dance of numbers and assurances. Thorne concluded with a flourish, shaking hands all around, radiating confidence. I believe we have a solid foundation here, gentlemen. Bridgeport is a town of opportunity. As the guests began to depart, Eleanor stood back, watching the mayor bask in their praise. He was so sure of himself, so sure he had woven a perfect web. But she knew. And she still had the small, folded tracing paper hidden in her pocket, a silent, damning truth. He had just promised complete transparency, and soon, darling, he was going to get it. The last of the bankers was gathering his papers, a polite smile on his face as he exchanged final pleasantries with Mayor Thorne. Lydia, looking radiant, was already at her husband's side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her eyes sparkling with pride. Eleanor moved quietly, collecting the empty teacups and the crumbs from the biscuit plates, her movements almost imperceptible. She could still feel the outline of the tracing paper in her pocket, a silent, secret weight against her hip. Mayor Thorne, his chest puffed out with the success of the meeting, caught sight of Eleanor as she approached the table. A glint of something cold, something almost playful, entered his eyes. He turned to Mr. Caldwell, the sharp-eyed lawyer who had pressed for complete transparency. Mr. Caldwell, Thorne began, his voice a little louder than necessary, drawing the attention of the remaining few guests. Allow me to introduce you to Miss Vance, a former employee of our Treasury Department. He paused, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips, as if sharing a private joke. Miss Vance is now assisting us in our General Records Office, helping to organize some of our older documents. A position, I might add, that requires keen attention to detail, but perhaps less involvement with the more complex financial figures. Eleanor's cheeks flushed, a hot wave of shame washing over her. She kept her gaze fixed on the teapot she was holding, her fingers tightening around the silver handle. She could feel their eyes on her, the polite, uncomfortable glances of the men who had just been discussing millions. It's important, you see, Thorne continued, now addressing the room, his tone warm and paternalistic, to ensure that every member of our staff is placed in a role where their particular talents can best flourish. Miss Vance, while a diligent worker, had, let's say, a slight difficulty with the more intricate numerical allocations during her time in the Treasury. Small things, of course. Nothing malicious, simply, misunderstanding of the finer points of public accounting. He gave a dismissive little wave of his hand, as if shooing away a bothersome fly. But we believe in second chances here in Bridgeport, don't we? Especially for those who are willing to learn from their oversights. So, Miss Vance is now with us in a supporting role, where her meticulous nature can be put to good use without the burden of grand financial responsibility. Lydia Thorne, who had been listening with a vague, pleasant smile, nodded vaguely, seemingly unaware of the cutting edge to her husband's words. Alderman Hayes, however, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting towards Eleanor, then quickly away. Eleanor felt a burning heat behind her eyes, but she refused to let a single tear fall. She met Thorne's gaze for a fleeting second, her expression carefully blank, betraying nothing of the raw humiliation she felt. He truly believed he had broken her, that she was just another piece of city property he could move around, a lesson to anyone who dared to question him. His arrogance filled the room, a thick, suffocating cloud. He thought she was powerless, a mere clerk with a difficulty with numbers. But as she lowered her gaze, a quiet, fierce resolve solidified inside her. He had just called her incompetent in front of the very men he needed to impress, the men who valued meticulous accounting. He had tried to crush her, to make her feel small and insignificant, and in doing so, he had just given her a gift, the unwavering certainty that she was doing the right thing. He would soon learn, darling, that a woman with a difficulty with numbers could still count, and she was counting every single one of his lies. The last of the bankers had finally moved towards the door, their polite murmurs filling the grand room. Mayor Thorne, still radiating a smug satisfaction from his performance, walked with them, his arm around Lydia's waist, his voice a low, confident rumble. Eleanor, meanwhile, continued her quiet work, gathering the last of the crystal glasses, her hands moving with a precise grace. The sting of his public dismissal still smarted, a raw wound, but it had also ignited a spark of fierce, unwavering resolve. Now was the time. She couldn't let this moment slip away, not with Mr. Caldwell, that sharp-eyed lawyer, still lingering near the table, his expression thoughtful. As Mayor Thorne escorted the last guest out, Eleanor moved to the center of the polished mahogany table, where a few stray documents from the presentation still lay. She set down the silver tray she carried with a soft, almost imperceptible clink. Mr. Caldwell turned, a curious look on his face. Alderman Hayes, who had been chatting quietly with Lydia, also paused, his attention drawn to her stillness. Eleanor took a deep breath, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached into her pocket, her fingers finding the folded tracing paper and the carbon copy of the invoice. She laid the small, crumpled carbon copy of an invoice for imported French topiaries, Grand Park Redevelopment Project, right in the middle of the table, beside a pristine city report. It was dated 2 days before she was dismissed for a sum of $1,100. The paper, so unassuming, seemed to pulse with a quiet power. Mr. Caldwell, Eleanor began, her voice, though soft, carried an unexpected strength that cut through the polite murmur of the room. Mayor Thorne spoke of transparency. She looked directly at him, her gaze unwavering. And of the Bridgeport Beautification Project, and the Grand Park redevelopment. Mayor Thorne, hearing her voice, turned back, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Miss Vance, what in heaven's name are you doing?" he snapped, his voice losing its smooth edge. "Clear these things away at once." Eleanor ignored him. She looked at Mr. Caldwell, then at Alderman Hayes, who now looked distinctly uncomfortable. This invoice, for imported French topiaries for the Grand Park, was paid from the City Development Fund, she explained, her voice gaining a quiet urgency. The Grand Park Redevelopment Project's procurement records, which I personally reviewed in the city archives, contain no entry for these specific items. None. Yet I distinctly recall Mrs. Thorne mentioning to Mr. Finch that magnificent French topiaries had just arrived at the Thorne estate for a summer garden party, around the same time this invoice was processed. Lydia Thorne gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with bewilderment and a sudden dawning horror. Alderman Hayes's jaw dropped. Mayor Thorne strode back to the table, his face a mask of furious indignation. "This is preposterous. A misunderstanding, a clerical error. Miss Vance, you are making a grave mistake." He reached for the invoice as if to snatch it away. But Eleanor was faster. With a swift movement, she pulled out the other document, the tracing paper, and laid it down next to the invoice. "And this," she continued, her voice now ringing with a clear, undeniable conviction, "this is a tracing of the forged signature of Alderman Hayes on an invoice for granite paving stones North Main Street, dated October 14, 1903, amounting to $7,800. It's on page 112 of the City Development Fund ledger, beneath a fabricated entry for Bridgeport Beautification Project supplies. She pointed to the tracing, then looked pointedly at Alderman Hayes. Alderman, you know your own signature better than anyone. Is this yours? Alderman Hayes peered at the tracing, his face paling. He slowly, hesitantly, shook his head. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible. No, that is not my signature. The room fell silent, a heavy, suffocating quiet. Mayor Thorne stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and dawning panic. His carefully constructed world, his grand performance, was crumbling around him, exposed by a quiet clerk and two small pieces of paper. The silence in the grand meeting room stretched, thick and suffocating, after Alderman Hayes's quiet, damning admission. Mayor Thorne stood frozen, his face, usually so smooth and confident, now a mask of utter disbelief and raw panic. His eyes darted around the room, settling on each face in turn, as if searching for an ally, a way out of the trap Eleanor had so meticulously set. But there was none. Lydia Thorne, her earlier joy utterly vanished, stared at her husband, her blue gown seeming to wilt around her. A single tear tracked a path down her cheek, not of anger, but of a profound, heartbreaking realization. Silas, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What have you done? Her world, built on his charm and supposed integrity, had just shattered. Mr. Caldwell, the sharp-eyed lawyer, was the first to break the heavy quiet. He picked up Eleanor's tracing paper, examining it closely, then glanced at Alderman Hayes. Alderman, you are certain this is not your hand? Alderman Hayes, looking utterly mortified, shook his head again, more firmly this time. No, sir, absolutely not. The mayor brought that invoice to me, said it was a formality for a payment already approved. I signed a different version, I believe, weeks before. Not this one. His voice, though still shaky, held the ring of truth. Mr. Caldwell's gaze hardened as he turned to Mayor Thorne. Mayor Thorne, this is far more than a clerical error. This is evidence of serious fraud, misappropriation of public funds, forgery. He laid the tracing paper and the invoice back on the table with a decisive tap. Gentlemen, he addressed the other bankers, his voice crisp. I believe our decision regarding the loan is clear. The lead banker, a portly man with a grim expression, nodded slowly. Indeed, Mr. Caldwell. Mayor Thorne, under these circumstances, our institution cannot possibly proceed with the proposed loan. The offer is withdrawn, effective immediately. He looked at Thorne, his eyes filled with professional distaste. Furthermore, given the implications of these revelations and the potential liabilities, the bank will have no choice but to review all existing loans and lines of credit associated with your private estate and businesses. We will be calling in our legal team at once to assess the full extent of this situation. Mayor Thorne finally found his voice, a strangled, desperate sound. No, this is a misunderstanding, a fabrication by a disgruntled employee. Miss Vance has a history of making errors. He pointed a trembling finger at Eleanor, his face contorted with fury and fear. Eleanor met his gaze, her expression calm, unyielding. My errors, Mayor Thorne, were simply seeing what you preferred to keep hidden. The lead banker stepped forward, his voice firm. Mr. Thorne, the evidence presented is compelling, and Alderman Hayes's testimony is unequivocal. We are not prepared to risk our investors' capital on an individual facing such grave accusations. As of this moment, all access to your accounts will be suspended while a full investigation is launched. Your assets, including your estate, will be placed under immediate review and potentially seized to cover any outstanding debts or to ensure restitution to the city. The words hit Thorne like a physical blow. His face went ashen. His grand estate, the symbol of his power and prosperity, was suddenly no longer his. His entire world, built on a foundation of lies, was crumbling around him, leaving him with nothing but a mountain of debt and the cold, hard stare of ruin. He swayed slightly, as if the very air had been knocked out of him. Lydia, now openly weeping, simply stared at him, a broken figure. Eleanor watched it all, a quiet observer to the swift, brutal dismantling of a man's deceit, a justice long overdue. The days that followed Mayor Thorne's public downfall were a whirlwind, a tempest that swept through Bridgeport, leaving whispers and shock in its wake. The bank, swift and unforgiving, froze all of Thorne's assets. His lavish estate, the very symbol of his deceit, was seized, along with his businesses, all to cover the vast sums he had stolen from the city and the crushing debts he now faced. The grand Thorne mansion, once vibrant with parties and laughter, stood silent and empty, a monument to a fallen man. As for Eleanor, her integrity shone through the scandal like a beacon. Caldwell, the sharp-eyed lawyer, had taken a keen interest in her case, ensuring her name was cleared and her reputation restored. The city, in a gesture of belated apology, offered her a position once more in the Treasury Department, with a significant raise and the quiet respect of her colleagues. But Eleanor, now with a quiet confidence she hadn't possessed before, politely declined. She had seen too much, understood too much, to simply return to the familiar ledgers. Instead, a most surprising opportunity arose. The bank, eager to offload the scandal-ridden Thorne estate quickly and discreetly, found themselves with few buyers. It was a beautiful property, yes, but tainted by the very name attached to it. Mr. Caldwell, impressed by Eleanor's shrewd mind and unwavering moral compass, approached her. He had quietly negotiated a deal, a ridiculously low price that, with the reward money Eleanor received for exposing the fraud and a modest loan the bank was eager to grant to redeem themselves, put the estate within her grasp. It was almost unheard of, a woman of her standing acquiring such a grand property. But the world was changing, and Eleanor, in her quiet way, was changing with it. One crisp autumn afternoon, Eleanor stood on the sweeping veranda of what was now her home. The air smelled of damp leaves and distant wood smoke. The house was enormous, far too grand for a single woman, yet it hummed with a strange, quiet dignity, now that its former owner's shadow no longer loomed. She walked through the silent rooms, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors, remembering the elegance of Lydia Thorne, the arrogance of Silas. A week later, there was a knock at the servants' entrance, a hesitant, almost pathetic sound. Eleanor, now dressed in a sensible but finely tailored wool gown, opened the door herself. Standing on the porch, his shoulders slumped, his once proud clothes threadbare, was Silas Thorne. Beside him, clutching a small worn valise, was Lydia, her face pale and drawn, her eyes vacant. They looked utterly destitute. "Miss Vance," Silas began, his voice hoarse, devoid of its usual charm. We have nowhere to go. My wife is unwell. We heard you purchased the estate. Perhaps there is some small work, some charity you could offer?" His gaze avoided hers, fixed on a point just beyond her shoulder. Eleanor looked at him, then at Lydia, whose misery seemed genuine. Her heart, though hardened by his betrayal, held a flicker of something close to pity for Lydia, but none for him. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice clear and steady, "there is indeed work. The grounds require constant attention. The stables, too. It is arduous, demanding labor. You would be a groundskeeper, a stable hand." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Your wife, Mrs. Thorne, may assist with light household duties, if she wishes. But understand, Mr. Thorne, you will be paid fairly, but you will work hard. And you will live in the small cottage by the stables, under my employ. Take it or leave it. Silas Thorne stared at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, humiliation, and a grudging, desperate understanding. His own home, now hers, and he, the once proud mayor, reduced to a common laborer on his own land. He swallowed hard, his gaze finally meeting hers. He nodded, a slow, defeated gesture. "Yes, Miss Vance, thank you. We accept." Eleanor simply nodded, a quiet sense of closure settling over her. The grand estate now had an owner whose heart was as true as its foundations. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.